Cleo fell asleep thinking about those tiny perfect hands. It was the fingernails that did it. Cleo could not stop thinking about them. She fell in love with those fingernails and their tiny fingers on their equally tiny hands. And over the course of the next week, she stopped thinking of it as the baby. It had become my baby. It was a seemingly trifling change in thinking, but it had major implications. The baby was now hers, and she couldn't imagine anyone else loving it or taking care of it. There was no longer a choice. She was keeping it, and Dante was entitled to know about the baby, but first she would have to think about how she would go about this. She had to make it perfectly clear that his responsibility began and ended with the baby. She wanted what was best for her baby, and what was best was for the father to provide some kind of financial support. She wasn't looking for some huge payday, even though she knew he would think otherwise. 2 weeks later, during her 12th week of pregnancy, Cleo was sitting in the waiting area of Dante's office, smiling nervously at Mrs. Clark. The woman, currently sporting a gigantic diamond on her ring finger courtesy of Mr. Whitman, who had proposed after just a month of courting, had happily agreed to help Cleo sneak in a visit with Dante. Cleo didn't want him to know she was coming, didn't want him to speculate about the purpose of her visit, so here she was ready to turn his carefree bachelor existence upside down. "He'll be done with that conference call in about 10 minutes, dear," Mrs. Clark informed her. "Would you like a cup of coffee or tea while you wait?" "No, thank you, Mrs. Clark, I'll be fine." As much as Cleo would have loved a cup of herbal tea to settle her nerves, her bladder had become ridiculously small over the last few weeks. She couldn't trust herself not to need a bathroom within minutes and miss her window of opportunity. She was nervous about seeing Dante again. Not just because of the news she had, but because she couldn't help wondering if that crazy chemistry would still sizzle between them. She didn't understand this attraction they had for each other. How could you want someone so desperately while disliking them so intensely? It was bizarre. Well, whether the chemistry still existed or not was a moot point. This baby would take care of any lingering desire soon enough. Dante was about to regret the day he'd met her. She was nervously twiddling her thumbs when Mrs. Clark looked up at her. "You can go in now, Cleo. And please bring this to Mr. Damaso." She handed Cleo a folder. Cleo straightened her skirt before taking the folder with trembling fingers. She halted outside of those intimidating walnut oak doors, straightened her shoulders, and, after a cursory knock, let herself in. His dark head was bent as he focused on his phone, and he didn't so much as glance up while she hovered awkwardly just inside the doors. She was so enthralled by the sight of him that when he spoke, she nearly jumped out of her skin. "Just leave the folder on my desk, Mrs. Clark," he said irritably, head still down. When she made no move to obey him, completely unable to unstick her frozen feet from the floor, he glanced up with an imposing frown. The frown deepened into a scowl when he saw her. That scowl certainly didn't bode well for the future of this meeting. At first, he just stared at her, making her wonder if he'd forgotten her name again, but after a few excruciatingly long moments, he finally spoke. "What are you doing here, Knight?" "I'm busy." "I'm aware of that, but I need to speak with you." "I don't have time for idle chit-chat," he said dismissively. "And quite frankly, I don't care what this is about. If you have any grievances about Whitman or your new position, take them up with Whitman's second in HR. Just because we happen to have a thing at some point doesn't entitle you to special privileges." "I don't want special privileges," she said automatically and then hesitated because she kind of did want special privileges. That slight hesitation put her on the defensive, and she grappled desperately for a way to regain momentum. She walked toward his desk and sat down in the same chair she had once sunk down into in a postcoital blaze. The memory of that morning was enough to stain her cheeks red, and the dilation of his pupils and tightening of his jaw told her he knew exactly why she was blushing. They both took a moment to lose themselves in that raunchy memory before Dante snapped back to reality. "You need to leave." "Not before I say what I came here to say," she maintained stubbornly. "I told you, I'm busy." "I don't care," she snapped, and then regretted her tone when he tensed and his eyes narrowed with temper. Look, I'm sorry to intrude, but I really have something important to tell you. I can't think of anything you'd have to say that could possibly be of interest to me, he growled, and settled back into his chair. He positioned his elbows on the armrests and steepled his hands just in front of his face. It made him look like a movie villain, which, she supposed, was the point. But if you really think it's that important, make an appointment. My time is precious, and I have no room in my schedule for you today. That will be all. Good day. She watched as he unfolded his tall frame and leaned forward to grab his phone and the folder she had dropped on the desk. She was so shocked by the rude dismissal that all she could do was gape at him as he got up and started to round the desk, clearly intending to leave the office. She jumped up and moved into his path. When he casually stepped right past her, she did the only thing she could think of. She ran to the door before he could get there and pinned her back against it with her arms spread out. He stopped directly in front of her. There wasn't much more than a foot between them. Knight, I won't hesitate to call security, he warned. You're starting to get on my nerves. I'm pregnant, she blurted, and the look of horror on his face would have been comical if Cleo wasn't so damned anxious about his response. Kay? He exploded hoarsely. Kay digest? I'm sorry. I don't, what did you say? He repeated in English, his voice brittle. You heard me, she said, keeping her chin up and defiant. I'm pregnant. I wish to know what you think you will gain from telling me this news. Is this some kind of joke? It's no joke, I'm pregnant. Very well. Let us play this game. He shrugged. Who is the father of this child you carry? You are. Sé que mientes. Te conozco muy bien. The frigid outpouring of Spanish told her more than anything else how much she had rattled him and how angry he was. He turned away from her and strode back to his desk, probably in an effort to put as much distance as possible between them. You're lying to me, he grated after he had the length of the office and a desk between them. I like being lied to even less than I like being blatantly manipulated. I'm not lying. She tried to sound calm even though she felt far from it on the inside. This was exactly the reaction she'd been expecting. She warily, and on unsteady legs, made her own way to the desk. She sank back into the chair simply because her legs could no longer support her. This is so much bullshit. I suggest you leave this office before I call security, and I want you to vacate the building in under an hour. You're fired. Her knees shook so badly they were practically knocking together, and her teeth were rattling in her head as shock caused her to quiver. You can't fire me, she whispered. That's completely unethical. Not as unethical as what you're trying to do right now. Don't bother to work out a month's notice either. We'll pay you a month's salary in lieu of notice. Using our past intimacy in this way is a complete betrayal. I no longer trust you to work for this company. I no longer believe that you are an ethical person, and I cannot have someone like you employed here. I'm pregnant, with your baby, she said adamantly, and he swore before picking up his phone and punching in a number. Send security up to my office. Immediately, he barked at whoever happened to be at the other end of the line. You need to hear me out, Dante, she said earnestly. This wasn't at all how she had expected this meeting to go. She'd known he would be upset, but this reaction was extreme even for Dante. I am Mr. Damaso to you, he flared arrogantly, and she snorted, fine. Mr. Damaso, one of your condoms failed, and one of your overambitious little soldiers found its mark and left me knocked up. She spoke fast, aware that time was a limited commodity. He moved away from the desk and turned his back on her, staring out the window and refusing to acknowledge her words. But Cleo kept talking. I'm keeping my baby. I don't want you to be a part of his life, and I don't want you to give me a huge amount of money. He swiveled back to face her at that pronouncement, his expression insultingly skeptical. Not a huge amount, but some, right? He mocked, well, yes. Of course. Of course. There was a world of sarcasm in those two words. Not a lot, a monthly allowance that will go only to this baby's health and well-being. I didn't ask for this, I didn't intend to get pregnant, but now that the baby is here, I can't do anything else but keep it and love it. But I can't afford to take care of a child without some sort of support from you. If you don't leave my office immediately, it will be rather embarrassing for you when security drags you out, he said coldly. Dante. Mr. Damaso, look, he held up a palm, and it shut her up immediately. Mierda. Enough. Enough of this now, Miss Knight. It was a good attempt to fleece me, but hardly very original. I suggest you go back to the real father of your child, that blonde giant, perhaps, and hit him up for some cash. Unless the two of you hatched this scheme up together? He thought Cal was her baby's father? She would have laughed at that if this whole situation weren't so damn tragic. She pulled an envelope from her shoulder bag and dropped it on his desk. Please read these documents I've had drawn up when you have the time. I understand that this has come as a complete shock to you, but maybe after you've calmed down, you'll be able to approach this situation in a more rational and calm manner. I am more than rational and calm, Miss Knight. I can see quite clearly what's happening here. Nonetheless, I'll leave these here. Two burly uniformed security guards finally stepped into his office, and he glared at them. Your response time is appalling, he gritted. I could have been murdered up here while you dawdled over your coffee and donuts. The two men apologized profusely, and he shut them up with a wave of his hand. See Miss Knight back to her desk, wait while she packs her personal items, and escort her out of the building. I want her gone within the hour. Yes, sir, one huge guy responded curtly while the other slanted her a sympathetic sideways glance. They approached her chair and flanked her, and one of them dropped a hand on her shoulder. Do not touch her. Dante surprised them all by snapping out the command. Sorry, the security guard mumbled awkwardly. You need to come with us, miss, the other guy said, and Cleo nodded, feeling defeated and exhausted. Her hand dropped protectively to her flat abdomen. The gesture was unconscious and seemed to draw his eye and darken his expression even further. She pushed herself up tiredly and grabbed one brawny guard's arm for support as she swayed slightly. She held on to him as they both escorted her out of his office. She could feel Dante's eyes boring into her back as she left, but she refused to look back. If this was how he wanted it, then so be it. She would find a way to look after her baby without his help. Dante Damaso be damned. Dante dragged both hands through his hair and gulped in a deep, semi-calming breath. The nerve of her. The goddamned, absolute gall of her. Who the hell did she think she was? Who did she think he was? Some naive fool who would fall for such a ridiculous and obvious ploy? He was absolutely livid. He wanted to wring her duplicitous little neck with both hands. He leaped into action, jumping out of his chair and striding determinedly toward the doors. Halfway there he turned back and grabbed the envelope she left on his desk. He didn't even want to look at it, but he'd need to show it to Mike Grayson, his personal attorney. He glared at Mrs. Clark on his way out. You and I will have words later about the type of riffraff you allow into my office. Mrs. Clark, he snapped, and the woman paled in response to his words. He was too furious to take even the mildest satisfaction in that reaction. 2 hours didn't do much to calm his temper. He found himself sitting across from Mike Grayson, still wearing the glare that felt like it had taken up permanent residence on his face. Mike had been startled to see his biggest client walk into his office earlier. Mike usually came to Dante, never vice versa. The fact that he had stormed into the man's office, defying their usual protocol, spoke to Dante's current frame of mind. He felt completely discombobulated. He was annoyed with himself for not seeing this coming. Surely he should have sensed this mercenary streak in her. He usually had a better nose for these things. When she had signed that non-disclosure agreement without much protest, he had considered himself in the clear. But he had completely underestimated the lengths some women would go to for a little bit of his wealth. I have to say, it's a pretty fair deal, the other man said. Exactly what Dante did not want to hear. She wants a monthly stipend from the baby's birth right up until its 18th birthday or until she marries, whichever comes first. She asks for only enough to take care of basic necessities, food, clothing, and medical bills for the child, not for her. She asks for an increase to cover school fees and other necessities when the child is old enough. There is, of course, interest applied commensurate to whatever changes take place in the economy. And she wants these only if a paternity test proves that you are indeed the child's father. Dante's jaw dropped. Why make that stipulation unless she was absolutely certain he was the child's father? Had she sabotaged his condoms somehow? He immediately discounted that possibility. They had never left his possession, and he was always the one to don them, without exception. Ever. He couldn't chance an accidental fingernail through the latex. He had learned that lesson the hard way, when he had caught one of his former lovers blatantly trying to break a condom while supposedly fumbling with it as she tried to sheath him. Having escaped that particular trap, Dante had never allowed for the possibility again. No woman ever got her hands on his condoms, which meant, if this baby was his, it was because his method of protection had failed. He had always known condoms were not 100% foolproof, but he had considered the risk negligible. Until now, he shook his head, disgusted with himself, with her, with the whole bloody world. I don't want to be a dad, he growled. Is there any way to get her to? He couldn't verbalize it. It made him feel like a louse. Well, she's got you covered there too, Mike said, sounding almost admiring. All you have to do is agree to these terms, sign this paper, and she's happy to forget you were even there at its conception. All financial transactions will be done through your attorney and hers. The baby will have her name, and the father shall remain undisclosed. And the existing non-disclosure agreement ensures that she will never speak of your relationship in Tokyo. It wasn't a relationship. Very well, your sordid encounter, then. Careful. Mike, Dante warned. He had known Mike for years and they had a fantastic professional and personal relationship, but Dante's mood was too uncertain at the moment to cope with the man's irreverent sense of humor. Mike hummed non-committally. Well, I think this is all pretty above board. She doesn't want a cent from you until you're satisfied that the baby is yours, and even then she won't expect payment to start until after the birth. Okay, so Dante was willing to concede that maybe she wasn't as mercenary as he'd first thought, and he was also willing to accept his culpability in the matter if, indeed, she did turn out to be pregnant with his baby. But she'd better be serious about not expecting anything more from him because he for damned sure wanted nothing to do with her or the baby. If he ever decided to have kids someday, the mother he chose for those children would be as far removed from Cleopatra Knight as night was from day. He would do his duty and pay whatever money she needed to raise her child. But that was it. No emotional commitments were required or expected of him, and he was satisfied with that. Cleo sat at her kitchen table staring at the damp stain on the wall above the refrigerator with a tub of melting ice cream forgotten in front of her. The front door opened and Cal stepped in, bringing with him the fresh smell of wind and rain. Hey. He removed his coat and tossed it carelessly over the back of the couch and grabbed a spoon from the drying rack on the sink before sitting down opposite her and helping himself to her softening chocolate mint ice cream. I don't know how you can eat this stuff in the middle of winter. It's freezing out there and you're sitting in here eating ice cream. She shrugged listlessly, barely hearing him. She sat with her cheek resting in the palm of one hand, one foot tucked beneath her butt and the other swinging in circles above the floor. She looked like a cranky child. How did it go? Cal asked softly, displaying more sensitivity than she would ever have given him credit for. I got fired. What? You heard me. She shrugged again. Ah, man. Han, I'm so sorry to hear that. What a complete dick that guy is. How could he fire you? He thinks I'm some. She heard her voice thicken with tears. I don't know. Some opportunistic, mercenary, money-hungry bitch or something. She shoved the ice cream aside and folded her arms on the table before burying her face in them and giving way to the tears that had been threatening all afternoon. Cal rubbed a hand up and down her back as she cried, her sobs quiet and her tears plentiful. "I don't know what to do," she confessed after a few long moments of cathartic crying. "I don't know what to do." "We'll figure it out, Cleo. I have no job, no savings, how can I take care of this baby? I can't move in with Luke and Blue. It would be so unfair." Just when they're starting to get their lives sorted out, along comes the family failure with another setback for them. "Don't think like that," Cal said. "Think solutions. Not problems." "What the hell does that even mean?" she asked, her voice seething with frustration. "How am I supposed to think solutions? What solutions? There are no solutions right now, Cal. So how about just letting me wallow for a few lousy moments?" "Wow." He sat back and took another spoonful of ice cream. "I'm going to assume that's the pregnancy talking." "It's not the pregnancy," she denied, as even more tears threatened. Where was this endless supply coming from? Surely she should have run dry by now. "It's everything. You've never really grown up, Cal. You don't know how to deal like an adult. So all you have are these preppy teen words of advice that don't mean squat in the real world. And this is mature behavior?" He fired back, waving his spoon up and down in her direction. "This crying fest, while you lash out at someone who cares about you instead of at the real object of your frustration. And how am I supposed to lash out at him? He had me kicked out of his office before I even had a chance to properly talk to him." "What, like, literally kicked out?" His eyes widened, "Called security and had me escorted out of the building," she confirmed, and his jaw dropped. "Seriously?" "Yes. I felt so." The tears overflowed again as she remembered the mortifying moment she was marched out of his office and back to her own desk. Humiliated. "That guy needs his ass kicked. Tell your brother about it." "No." She could hear the panic in her own voice. "No, Cal, Luke doesn't hear about this. He's not to know who the father of this child is." She was too embarrassed to let Luke know what a colossal mistake she'd made with Dante. And she couldn't ruin a friendship he held dear. "But what will you tell him about your job?" "I'll tell him I quit or something. It'll be easy enough for him to believe of his loser sister." "Come on, hon," Cal said. "That's hardly fair. This wasn't your fault. Please just leave it for now." Cal nodded reluctantly and Cleo reached over to squeeze his forearm gently. "I'm sorry I snapped at you, okay?" "Yeah." He shrugged. "I'm sorry I wasn't grim enough to suit the occasion." She giggled wetly at the lame joke, and Cal grimaced before reaching into his pocket for a handkerchief. "Jesus, blow your nose," he said. "Look at the state of you. You're such an ugly crier, Cleo." "Shut up," she laughed, and blew her nose gustily. At that moment she just appreciated his presence so much that she couldn't hold back an impulsive hug.